Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Stephen O'Grady with RedMonk, and I'm here today with Jason to talk about some AI stuff. Jason, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good to talk to you again, too, Steve. So, everyone, I'm Jason Warner. I'm one of the co-founders over at Poolside. We're doing the world's most advanced AI for software development. Before Poolside, I was a CTO at GitHub for 4 years, 2 years pre-acquisition by Microsoft, 2 years post. Before that, similar type of roles at Heroku, which is a platform as a service now owned by Salesforce. And before that, Canonical, the people who make Ubuntu Linux. So I am pretty not handy around anything that does not involve a computer.
And you've been around a bit, so you have some opinions, which we're about to get into. So, the big reason I want to have you on is that AI, I think for a lot of folks has just sort of taken over the industry, right? There's all this talk and all this attention, all this sort of time spent, and so much of it focuses on models or demos or GPUs and so on. And one of the things that, at least for me, I won't speak for you, that can kind of get lost in the shuffle is the training data and specifically questions about it, right? What is that data? Where did it come from? Who owns it? How is it licensed? What are you permitted to do with it? What are you not? And so on and so on. And so, we're seeing some of those questions sort of surface in the finalization of the definition of open source AI. And, that'll, sort of that will be one opinion on it, certainly. But given that I know you have opinions on the importance of training data, let's just start there. So like, for you and for Poolside, like what is your position with respect to training data?
So generally speaking, this is so semantical definitions and Twitter debates about what words mean aside. Let's just put all that out there so we don't get into all these really esoteric discussions.
Yeah.
I will say this, that if somebody is not showing you their training data, they are not open by whatever definition we're going to try to use here. But what we are doing at the moment, which is saying, hey, here are the weights to a model, therefore it is quote unquote open source, and we're going to go use that. That's
Right.
essentially useless. That is the worst possible definition of
Right.
open. That
Yeah.
is effectively, if we go back generations, and you and I, Steve, fortunately are old enough to go back and do this, that is equivalent to releasing a .exe and saying that's open source, or the compiled binary and saying we're open source. And none of us would be fooled by that. But in this space, we're being fooled by that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think actively fooled, and sort of as you and I have talked about before,
Yeah.
and I won't ascribe any opinions to you, but I have strong ones on sort of the use of open source and sort of definitions and so on here. And it is enormously frustrating, because we're still working on what the definition is and what that means, and they're hard questions as we'll get to in just a minute. But I think it's pretty easy in a lot of cases to say what is not open source. And there are, sort of a majority at this point of entities which are going around, in my opinion, abusing and misusing and misapplying that term. And, it's to date, at least the sort of press has been sort of credulous and gone along with that and said, oh, hey, so and so told me this is open source. Of course it is. And yeah, and then we sort of end up in a world where, to your point, like an exe is sort of open source, which it's not how this works. Um, anyway, so I don't want to get you into trouble there. I'm
Oh, no,
fine having my own
this is
opinion.
not a topic I think is actually going to be getting anybody in trouble. I think this is stating what all of us know. But
Yep.
for various financial reasons or marketing reasons, the entire
Hmm.
industry is trying to go down a certain path. And we know the players involved. We know the
Right.
people who are doing whatnot. And we also know the
Yep.
disadvantages that's put out there by saying, here's our open training data. But
Yep.
I mean, this is the thing. All of us have the same data. We're all pulling down Common Web. We're all pulling down open source repos. We're all filtering similarly, not identical and all that. Now,
Mhm.
the weighted distributions of the models might be different and all that. But really what it comes down to is where people are trying to infuse gray market, black market, or private data. So some of the larger entities are putting stuff in there. This is why they don't show the data sets to folks.
Yep.
One thing the Poolside we've talked about all the time, we're selling the enterprises. We're gonna make this available for everybody on the internet, and it's going to be available as Poolside Cloud. Everyone's going to use it. We're going to power things like the Devons and the Replets and the Codys of the world, people who use other models, et cetera. But we're also going to sell to the enterprises and governments. And I've gone to every single enterprise and I said, listen, hold me to task. You need to be able to inspect my data set. And there's a lot of good, valid reasons why. And I'll walk you through, if you're not asking this question of other vendors, why you should be asking this question of other vendors.
Which actually was a perfect segue, in fact, because sort of that inspection is something I wanted to get to. So, right, so one of the things with a lot of these training data sets, as we all know, right, is that some of them are enormous, right? They've been trained on the internet or some sort of subset of it, and so that brings up sort of two questions. Like one, how, like practically speaking, logistically speaking, like how do you make these things available? And then sort of more specifically, even if you can do that, if I'm a sort of customer and I want to inspect it, like how, like practically speaking, like how do I do that? How do I introspect this database of or data set, I should say, of just enormous size?
Yeah. So there's an impracticality to what I just said. Now, what I'm trying to show these vendors is that I actually am open. I am willing to turn over this
Yeah.
manifest to you so that you can go and do some work here. I also think that there's going to have to be some companies, third-party vendors, some auditor type of things that enter the conversation and are able to do that for folks. But it's also similar to how we say, hey, Linux is open source, and what, 200 people on the planet actually go and read the source
Yeah.
code to
Right.
this as well. That said, it's possible to go do this. And so there's,
Yeah.
varying degrees of the spectrum of I'm willing to go do it versus I'm not willing to go do this. So there's impracticality. This is much denser than what even the Linux source code is going to be if you're training on, trillions of tokens and all that sort of stuff. But I still think you got to be able to open it up. I still think they should be able to spot, check, and sample. I also think that there should be
Hmm.
some new pieces of software, some new vendors that pop up and or help people navigate this. And I've seen a couple of startups that actually do this now. It's like we'll help you understand what training data is coming into your own models if you're building them internally, but
Terrific.
also from
Okay.
vendors who are open about their manifests.
Okay. Yeah. So in other words, I mean, almost what we're talking about to your point around Linux is that it's almost the optionality, right? In
Yeah.
most cases, you're not going to leverage it, but you need the ability to, if possible. So, okay. So
Well,
that,
and I think it's a slight orientation difference too, which is if you walked over to some of these people who are claiming to be open as well about their let's call them their models
yeah,
here, they're open about their models, and you say, "Show me the manifest." They're like, "Oh, hang on a second there. That's because the way that things work, you can hide a lot of stuff in there. I mean, there's all the conversation around what is actually gray market data out there that other people are using, whether it be copyrighted from something else or a torrent of books, or whether or not they're only using open access or maybe slightly closed or all that sort of stuff. And the fact that you can't ever find it without the open manifest, but it's possible to find it if it was.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And like again, I think really what we're talking about is sort of the optionality here, right?
Yeah.
Sort of preserving that sort of, to the extent that it's logistically possible, at least. All right. So last question before I get you out. I know that there's a lot to this, obviously. There's the questions around access, availability, the technology to introspect it, and so on. What other, when you talk to, sort of your customers, just others in the field, what are the other things that you think they need to think about, with respect to the training data itself? Like I know you and I have talked about this before, and I know you have pretty strong opinions on benchmarks as an example. But if I'm an enterprise and I'm sitting here, thinking about, all right, I'm going to consume XYZ model. What are other things, what are the other sort of pieces here that I need to be thinking about with respect to what it was trained on?
Yeah, so I do think that I think benchmarks are the worst possible thing that we've ever done in the industry, like SweBench and that sort of thing. Likely, largely because most people train on those, and so they're obviously that we call it uh, uh, benchmark abuse. People are abusing these things to train them and get them over the line. The one that freaks me out the most, though, is there's two. The one that freaks me out the most is the one that Andre Carpathia talked about some from the Anthropic paper, which is the sleeper agent one, which that is the one that gives me keeps me up at night the most.
Yep.
Now that is a theoretical a vulnerability vector
Hmm.
that I
Yep.
don't know how real it has been, but that being said, my history. I've been in the open source world for years. I assume you've been compromised. I assume you've been popped. I assume all these things so that you act like you are, so that you can build the proper
Right.
defenses against it. So we should
Yep.
actively assume that those things are happening at the moment so that we can build the defenses against it. So that's one.
Yep.
Most people in the world won't care what I say next, but this is actually critically important for enterprises in particular. But in a weird roundabout way, as you and I, two old open source heads, the enterprises have to be concerned with the more viral license types that are happening in these models, because there's a whole bunch of tools in last
Hmm.
gen that have been put in place to give them
Yeah.
safety and security. But and you can still use those, but in this case, it's a very different risk vector for them on
Yep.
the commercial and the viral license types. And so you
Hmm.
have to start asking questions around that as well.
Yeah, man. That's the thing is that you love to see sort of the collaboration and the energy and so on in some of the communities like Hugging Face and so on. But oh man, I mean, you just go and read some of those licenses and you're like, oh wow.
Yeah.
Like, has anybody ever looked at these? Like, who wrote this
So
and so on.
this is
So
another strongly held opinion I have here, which is that we basically have entered into a generational gap between, let's call them, last generation open source and current generation open source. And what we've not done is we've not understood that they're pain transfers. So we've already been through these lessons. We've been through these
yeah,
multiple times, but
yep,
we're going to have to learn these again for a generation of folks that are building in a net new domain. It's kind of like all platform shifts go through the same machination problems. We don't learn the lesson. We're still
yep,
funding companies that are effectively building on other people's platforms, not realizing that those companies are
yep.
dead already. We just don't know it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back on to talk about that. But the licensing thing in particular, it's so frustrating because we're just going to go through and have to relearn these things where it's like, hey, we figured this out. This is a problem. This
Yeah.
is how we solve the problem, and it's like they're going to speed run essentially all of the mistakes that have been
Well, they're
made.
going to speed run them, and this is interesting. And they're going to smack headlong into GCs. They're going to run headlong into corporates who are saying, "F you, we're never using your product." There is zero chance we're going to do this, and people will
Yep.
try to explain away why it's
Mhm.
fine, and it's
Yep.
not going to work because it
Nope.
never works. You have to understand the concern on that side of the fence and adapt to it.
Yeah, you really have to work backwards with what's going to clear legal,
Yep.
unfortunately. So, all right. Well, this has been great. I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about, well, all of the things sort of involved here because this is a space that A is moving quickly and B has, I don't know, as far as I can tell, an infinite number of moving pieces. But for today, yeah, really appreciate you coming by, Jason. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.